Well, hello, welcome once again to Pale Blooms and Beyond. Thank you for joining us today. Don Cooper is an American singer, songwriter, author, and music teacher. He has recorded for Roulette and Atco Records and toured the US and Europe. Don first showed up on my radar with his early 1970s albums, Bless the Children and The Ballad of C.P. Jones. He has created music for film, theater, video, commercials, and for children's programming, as well as publishing several music and book titles for Random House. Don is also a master teaching artist, creating, coordinating, and presenting arts residencies in many schools and towns. Don currently resides in St. Augustine, Florida, where he continues to write, record, and perform his music. My guest's latest album is 2022's Pictures and Stories. For more info on Don, check out his website at doncoopermusic.com. Well, welcome, Don. Here. All righty. Thanks for joining me today.
My pleasure.
All right. Glad we found the time that suitable for both of us. Well, take us back to the beginning. Where were you born?
Oh, dear. All right. I was born in Kansas City, Missouri.
All right. Do you recall any of the early years there, fond memories growing up?
Oh, well, I was there only until I think my family moved a lot. I think I was there until I was 5 years old or so in the first place. I remember quite a bit, surprisingly. I find as that the more years go by, my longer term memory seems to get more prevalent. So,
Yeah.
but yeah, I was still a little bit rural in Kansas City. My father was a milkman. I remember riding in the back of his milk truck and fascinated by dry ice. And I can still smell the smell of all that. They were kind of like lead milk cartons. There was a heavy, intense smell. I have a real sentient memory of that, and there's a number of, just childhood memories.
Yeah. Well, it's funny how those things stay with you, like that. And as far as mentioning growing up during that time period and your long-term memory, my short-term memory starting to go. So like the walking into the room and saying, "Why did I walk in here?" That's starting to happen.
You believe in the hereafter, what am I here? That was
Yeah. Right. Did I close the garage door when I left? And I'll back up, and I did, but it's wild. Okay. Well, how about early on? Do you remember hearing music in the household?
It becomes more and more. Yeah, I do. I remember. Then I moved up into St. Paul, Minnesota. So I'm probably around second grade, and but I remember also young in Kansas City, we had one of those large floor standing radios, and we'd listen to Hopalong Cassidy, I remember, and different radio shows. So I know there was music there, but it doesn't really stick with me at that. But then I remember getting the mumps when I'm in second grade and staying home from school and playing Hank Williams' Cold Cold Heart on a 78 all day long. I mean, it really sticks with me, and I'd kind of forgotten it. But so I believe, as I kind of reflect on it, that my mother must have been into country, because why else would we have? But of course, that was a big hit. But she had that record, and that stuck with me always. And then my dad, and then I moved on, and somewhere in early middle school, I moved up to Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and I think it was like fifth grade, and I had two paper routes. I had a morning route and an afternoon route. And Wisconsin cold in the winter, and I had like maybe 32 customers or something. And Sunday's paper of the Milwaukee Sentinel was obviously larger,
Yeah.
And my dad, who's a traveling salesman, was normally only home on the weekends. And he wasn't real generous for that time because he'd been out working, supposedly. And so he uncharacteristically finally offered that on Sunday mornings he would drive me instead of walking my route. He would drive me, we'd pick up the papers because they were just too heavy. And he'd deliver my Sunday route with me. And his one rule was that we could only listen to his radio station. I could not mess with it.
Change it. Huh.
And so I got inundated with a lot of standards and things, you know, that still stick with me, and they emerge. I'll be playing, and lyrics will come out of me. I wonder why on earth are those so embedded, you know? And they're there, and I that's about the only source I can think of was my dad's radio station. So and then there was a stereo, and then by the time I got into high school, early high school, we had, once again, there's that time of the big console stereos, and I would lie down next. They had speakers on the sides of the wooden cabinet. I can remember lying down, and I would lie down next to that speaker and play all the time. And my mom, I recall a lot of show tunes. I mean, this point, I'm reflecting on this now. I was not really aware of those influences until I started wondering why some of this stuff comes about, you know. So I believe there was more music than I thought of, but I started playing and getting involved in my own music for a long time. And I had a 4-year older sister. Our first 45 was Hound Dog. And also was Guy Mitchell singing the blues. And the B-side was I'm an Old Hoot Owl, as I recall.
Okay.
And then an Elvis Presley, 4 songs on the 45, 2 on each side. I remember Peace in the Valley. They were kind of like religious songs that he did. Had a green record label. So those things, I believe that music has always been very prevalent to me. I started playing pretty young. I started writing very young. And
Well, was I wanted to ask you, was the guitar the first instrument you learned to play?
Ukulele first.
Oh, okay. Okay.
And I think that was probably around in 4th grade.
Okay. I've heard that ukulele, a lot of the UK musicians I visit with, they say that was their first instrument too.
Well, it was cheaper.
Right.
It was, you know, more manageable from hand size in a way. It didn't last that long. I mean, one of the greatest Christmases in my memory was around that time. And I think it had to be my mother. My dad was never real supportive until I started making money. And then he thought, okay, it's okay.
Okay.
But coming downstairs, and there was a baritone ukulele under the Christmas tree. And that's when I really, really got into it. And that lasted for maybe about a year. And then I moved to guitar. And had an old Stella guitar with action about 6 inches off the neck, you know. It was really painful to play. And I realize now, you know, that I really have always really wanted it because I endured that with bloody fingers and all that stuff. You know, I'm sure many people say it, you know.
Yes, I've heard those stories too. Yeah. Well, you didn't know if it.
And later on in my life, when I became teacher, when I taught some, after I was 50, I taught for a while, and I would always tell parents, don't buy the kid a cheap instrument, man. You know, don't make it. It's hard enough to keep them interested in practicing rather than having them be tortured by physical pain.
Right.
But I also, as a parent, understand, you know, I'm not going to invest $300 in something that could be just a passing fancy. But
there you go. That's good. That's right. Well, were you completely self-taught?
Yeah, I was. Well, I had the ukulele. The reason I got into it, I had my older friend, my 2 friends who were doing it too, had an older brother who would have been my sister's age. So he's probably like early in high school. And Flatt and Scruggs at Carnegie Hall, that album first came out. So we're moving into the beginning of the folk revival. And that particular album brought bluegrass kind of to the fore to Wisconsin. Living in Florida now, I understand that bluegrass has been driving here all along, you know, but when you got farther north in the Northeast, it was kind of an eclectic thing. And but he played bluegrass, and ultimately got me in to buy my first Martin guitar, which I still have here. I don't know if it's sitting over there, if the Martin's there or not. Yeah, that's the Martin. That's still it.
Right there.
So he taught me some things, but mostly it was, and back then, you know, it wasn't like now where you have all sorts of internet tutorials and all these things, you know. Back then, it was just listening to the record over and over, trying to find the
Right.
changes, getting a
Right.
book with chord positions on it, figuring it out,
Right.
and that's kind of how it went, and I don't think I never really I've never taken a lesson, I guess, come to think of it. I went to school ultimately later on in my life and learned to identify all the stuff I knew in terms of technical musicianship and chord structure and, theory.
Okay.
But originally it was just that folk route, just
Yeah.
playing and playing.
Right.
Uh,
Well, we'll talk about some of the other artists and musicians that you started to absorb and become influenced by.
well, in 63, probably, I hitchhiked from Milwaukee to Madison, Wisconsin, where my sister was in college. So I must have been about a sophomore in high school, something like that, to see
Mhm.
Bob Dylan uh, on stage as a solo, as a young Bob Dylan.
Uh-huh.
And it was magical. I mean, he was magical. Besides being because of the songwriting and the content, which all of a sudden became more poetic and more opinionated than what was on the radios. Uh,
Right.
and at that same time, 63, that would have been it. Yeah. And so Dylan really turned me around. Dylan made me commit to writing. From about that time on, I very little covered. But then I moved to St. Paul in Minnesota, and a guy who just passed away last night, Spider John Kerner. I used to go down to
Yeah.
the West Bank at the University of Minnesota because I
Right.
moved many high schools, so we kept moving around. So I didn't have my social scenes had to develop. So quite
Right.
often early on, I'd be on my own. And I found myself down at the university campus when I was like a junior in high school. And Kerner, Ray, and Glover were playing at that point in time. Dave Ray was still a medical student, and John Kerner and Tony Glover. And they moved me into blues, but I had already been into Leadbelly and a lot of older blues, Lightning Hopkins and things before that. So it was kind of like starting out with the blues. Dylan moved me into writing. And then the folk revival came on strong, and I continued. I became a very deeply involved with Fred Neil. I really enjoyed Fred Neil as a writer and an artist.
Oh, oh
Uh,
yeah. I'm
a
sorry, I'm
lot,
listening. Go ahead. Go ahead.
and a lot of that, a lot of folk artists. At that point in time, even though I was starting to write more, by
Yeah.
65, by the time when I was getting ready to graduate and then move on to the university, I was pretty much doing my own material, except that there was a club in Kansas City, Missouri called the Vanguard
Mhm.
that was run by a guy named Stan Plesser who created Good
You know,
Karma
I,
Productions.
I just wanted to interject real quick about Fred Neil. Most people don't realize he wrote Everybody's Talking, and was the first to record it. Before Nilsson.
Oh,
Everybody thinks Harry Nilsson was the originator, but not so. Anyway, go ahead.
and also at that time, and Jesse Colin Young early on, Soul of a
Oh,
City Boy, before it was the Youngbloods. I mean,
right.
those were a lot of influence. Elvis was obviously a big influence. Younger, when I on ukulele and early guitar, I covered all of. I had my sister had all of Elvis's gold records. It was an album with all his gold records on it, and I covered all those songs, Teddy Bear and Love Me Tender and all those. So which I think led to my still a certain crooning quality in my voice, which I sometimes lament, but I hold on to it.
Yeah.
Uh, and uh, and that was about what I was doing. And when I was a senior, once again, I moved again to another high school and lived a little outside of Kansas City, not in really nice suburbs, but just a little on the outside. And the Vanguard was downtown, down by the Art Institute. And my dad had a company car, which is a pretty new, so he'd get a pretty new car every year as a company car. And I would drive this kind of new Chevrolet Impala down to Kansas City into the city and park it blocks away. And my cousin, older cousin, had a pair of blue jeans that he'd accidentally gotten into the wash that had bleach in it. So they looked distressed before the term of distressed jeans happened.
Right.
And the zipper was also broken. So I would duct tape the zipper and have these kind of distressed looking blue jeans. And I had a pair of cowboy boots. And I had an old blue denim shirt. And so, I mean, I was really playing it up. I was into the game. And I would drive and I'd park my dad's Impala, blocks away, walk down to the Vanguard. And I was covering Dylan songs with a harmonica brace and everything. But Dylan was not really a common name.
Yeah, yeah.
So,
Did you happen to see my interview with Carolyn Hester?
no, I didn't, but I know
Yeah.
Carolyn Hester's reputation and name, yeah, and
Yeah.
work.
And she gave Dylan his first gig. He was
I
going around begging somebody, can I play on your album? Can I play with you? And she
I
said, you can
recall,
play harmonica on her one of her albums. So
yeah.
anyway,
And so I would go down there, and I'm chagrined to say this, by sins of omission, I
uh-huh.
would play these songs, and I would not credit Bob Dylan on these songs. I'd perform in this folk club,
Yeah.
and ultimately the people like Brewer and Shipley played there a lot. Danny Cox, it was where that whole uh, Midwestern folk scene was happening, and so they were down there, and they were all older than me. And for about 5 months, I kept this persona. They actually thought I was some street kid coming in off the street, and I was, I guess, I kind of played the Bob Dylan card. I just didn't talk about it, and I let this persona emerge. Ultimately, it was disclosed that I was a suburban kid that was driving down.
Did you start any fashion trends back then?
No, I didn't. No, no. I think the sale and duct tape went up, as I recall.
Yes, right.
Uh, but because of that, but then I was performing regularly in a club on stage with a regular sound system. It was a regular good gig, and then and that led me to phase out of my cover of Dylan and start doing my own material, which is and from that point on, I pretty much wrote.
Yeah. How did you start? It's always interesting to hear about, most musicians start out playing cover tunes. How did you gain that confidence writing your own material?
I always wrote. It was not so much the confidence to write it; it was the confidence to give it any sort of self validation enough that they were worthy to present out in public. And I think it was timing. It was 1960, mid 60s. There was more of a movement of a singer songwriter emerged. The folk revival brought that out some, even though it was a lot of traditional things. There were more people writing. Uh, and I was in Columbia, Missouri, which to this day remains. We were kind of like, a bunch of us kind of like started this concept that original music was where the value was. And so that culture in that period of time, in that particular community, promoted and supported original music, and therefore I had venues to play. I had a number of people that, were writing along with me and things like that.
Okay. Did you do any busking?
Uh, Busking per se, let me think. I didn't really, no, mostly I got paid.
Okay. Well, good for you. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I've been very fortunate. I've remained a working musician, even when, including teaching and things of that sort. I've remained a working musician all my life.
Okay. Well, good. Were you ever part of a band?
Oh, many times, all sorts of them. Yeah.
Okay.
In high school, I was a front man for R&B groups. I wasn't here I was going down to play the folk clubs, but that was not really a paid gig at the Vanguard. I would go in there. I was glad to get in there. But I would make money by being a front man, a singer, for R&B bands, and a lot of James Brown, a lot of all sorts of things, Junior Walker, all sorts of stuff like that. and so that was a lot of bands, and then also then bands would start up, you know, at that period of time. You know, the early, we didn't call them garage bands back then, but that's, you know, a Farfisi, a bass, an electric guitar. You know, early on, before that, I had different musical groups where we would work together. We had a Wallensack tape recorder of a dad. His dad was a psychiatrist, and he had a Wallensack tape recorder, and we would use that as our sound system, not to record. Our sound system. And you know, and a lot of Beach Boys tunes and things of that sort at that period of time. I actually one of the early concerts, well, the first concert I went to see Carlos Montoya. I don't know how I ended up there, actually, really young, uh, which blew my mind. This little man came out with this big guitar and filled an auditorium all by himself, and I was just awestruck.
Yeah.
And I went back, and we were probably in 8th grade. We went backstage in an old theater, so it had the metal catwalks going up to this where the dressing room was, and the curtain was closed. It was just there, back there, and these two women in very austere black dresses and severe buns, obviously Spanish, were there. I'm pretty sure one was his wife, the other might have been his daughter, you know, and there's these two young boys sitting on a bench like this waiting, you know, and the theater's all cleared out. And we said, we'd like to see Mr. Montoya, you know, and I was so impressed. She went, the maestro is resting. And I went, wow. We had to wait. And we went up and knocked on the door. I think that even in 8th grade, he might have been shorter than we were even then. He was
He was a short guy. Yeah.
and it was kind of like being in the presence of some magical thing. But
Yeah.
that same, shortly after that, a couple years later, maybe 3, actually the Beach Boys opened up for James Brown on a tour. I mean,
Oh,
which is one of the strangest bills, but we liked
right.
it, you know.
Right.
And James Brown, he had TV Mama with him at that point in time, you know. So that was all. That was kind of what we were doing band wise. We were doing a lot of R&B and a lot of Beach Boys, because the Beach Boys were just kind of breaking out, and
Yeah.
so you know, we were just covering so that stuff. And then in college, I was with several bands, and we still stayed pretty much on acoustic guitar. I was a vocalist and acoustic guitar player,
Mhm.
but then just went on and on. You know, had bands. When I started recording, I put bands together, took bands apart, got into other things. I was always pretty much a band leader. So bands, I usually formed bands around what I was doing rather than sitting in.
Right. Right. Well, you were there at the forefront, or maybe a precursor to the singer-songwriter movement.
Uh, well, as far no, yeah, I know that's exactly my timing. That's what allowed me to continue on.
Right.
My timing was I was in that niche when singer songwriter everyone was looking for one, and I became one that was found.
Right. Right. We'll talk about signing with Roulette Records, uh, who was run by an infamous figure, Morris Levy.
Yeah, one of the most infamous. We went to I was a senior in college. Uh, I was an English major. I was I didn't know what I was going to do, but I was in School of Education. I thought, well, I'll be an English teacher. And college was very affordable then. I think I paid $1,000 a semester. You know, I could make enough money in the summer to go to school, you know, but then I would bartend and gig at the same time. So, you know, but and this guy kept coming into where I would bartend in this place, and then I would go play sets on the stage, and then I would come back to bartend. And this guy kept coming in who was my age, but I mean, I was a total hippied out person at that point in time. Still am in some sense. And he would come in and he had a sport coat and a nice watch, and he had like strange dress shoes, you know. And I'm looking at the guy, and by the way, I liked him, and we talked a lot, and he came in to hear me play. And I thought, what the heck's with this guy, you know? And it turns out that he dropped out of college. He'd gone there on a football scholarship, and he dropped out and started selling insurance. And he was a salesman, just no doubt about it. And so at one point in time, finally, I convinced him that he shouldn't be doing that. He should be more free spirited. It was 1967, 68, and through vehicles I won't discuss, I changed his consciousness, and he quit his insurance job and went to Colorado, and called me up about to ski bum, and called me up over Christmas break, and he said, "Come out here. I have a gig for you." And he'd convinced me out in Vail, Colorado, and this place called the Clock Tower, which was their place right in the middle of town. And he'd talked the owner of the Clock Tower in ski season to fire the act that he had and hire me for 2 weeks, never having heard me.
Yeah, sight unseen. Yeah, hadn't heard
Just
you.
by virtue of how much he could talk, he got me the gig. So I went out there and I played for 2 weeks, and it was wonderful. Got paid well. I mean, I went, wow. And his name was Pete, and he said at that point in time, he said, I think what I should do, I think I should be your manager. And I had no idea what that meant, and he had no idea what that meant. But having executed this phenomenal thing for me that I saw, I went, by all means.
Yeah.
And he went back, and we went back to Missouri, and the guy was a promoter of money. He all the way through. He remained my partner, and always did the same thing, and got enough money together for us to go to Chicago and cut a 10-song demo of my own material. And in the spring of that year, of my senior year in college, he said, "Let's go." And he raised enough money way in front. And the guy was phenomenal. He came up with an idea that he would sell index cards. I think got like $20 a piece from them, and there was a couple of wealthy girls' schools in that town. And so he would sell index cards for this money to these. It was like the pre GoFundMe. He would sell the index cards with the promise that there would be a credit on the back of the first album. There was no album, there was no deal, there was no nothing. We had a demo, but he sold enough and raised enough money that we went to New York. We flew to New York. And I told him, I said, if we get a record deal, I will stay, which is, I'm 2 months away from graduating,
Right.
and I said, and if we don't, well, I'll come back and I'll graduate and I'll teach English. Well, we walked in there, and the first 2 nights we walked around the city. We had no place to stay. We just literally walked around the city, and then connected with an old friend and stayed there. And about 2 weeks later, we had 3 record offers. And once again, this is back to the before. It was timing. I'm not.
Yeah. Yeah. Right.
The material and my performance was strong enough to carry it, but that, it was timing.
Yeah.
And I think Cat Stevens was out there. Harry Nielsen was out there, but the singer-songwriter individual was really starting to come. James Taylor had not really emerged, was just about to pop out. Croce was just about to move. I mean, it was all right in there. And so I had 3 different offers because I was a singer-songwriter based on this demo tape. But I went in and we're not going to fall into that trap of signing a bad contract. We didn't know. We didn't have a lawyer. And roulette, and we demanded, which now is ludicrous, we demanded, well, we won't sign with anyone that won't promise there will be a record out within 1 month. Stupid. But we thought that was the way to secure, well, they're serious because,
Yeah.
and so roulette, Morris Levy said, "Sure, kid, we'll give you a record out in a month," and so and a substantial advance, which coming out of the Midwest with nothing, we went, wow,
Yeah.
Holy, here we are. And that's just one of the busking things I had in those first 2 weeks. I would busk in Central Park on the way. There were concerts in the park going on, big concerts, and I would get on that thing and I would busk for all that foot traffic. And it was Manhattan, and I'd make money that I was surprised at the amount, and that kept us, that and Pete still had a Diners Club card left over from his insurance thing day. So we had no money. We ate in good restaurants because only good restaurants would take Diner Club.
I'm glad he held
And,
on to that. Yeah.
and so we signed with Morris. We signed the 10 record deal. Didn't know what we were doing. Cross collateralized everything. Gave away 100% of my publishing. Went into a little studio called Incredible Sound in Midtown down on 48th Street, I think, where you had to pee in the sink. There was no functional bathroom.
Okay, all right.
And got a producer named Hutch Davies, who was out of, but Roulette didn't really know. Tommy James was on Roulette. Morris game, which I unfortunately learned the hard way, was really just to sign artists, get all the publishing, not put them in. I mean, I could go into long stories about that. If you read a book called Hitmen and some of these things, I mean, there's this was the Genovese family. I didn't know at the time, you know, and so they didn't know what popular music was. There was a guy, Fred Mineo, who brought me in. His wife Susan actually became Donna Summer's manager.
Okay.
Years later, they were kind of hip. They knew, but it was back in the day. You know, I would go in there, and there was a room where two guys, I forget their names, they were great guys, became good friends of mine, would write. They'd have a Billboard magazine on the piano in front of them, and they'd be going down. It's kind of like Nashville still does, and they'd be going down the list of songs and write songs in that ilk to try to get them placed.
Yeah.
You know, so it was like the whole scene hadn't really grasped it. So they hooked me up with a producer named Hutch Davies, who came out of the Bob Crew generation, which was totally opposite of what I was doing.
Right.
But I didn't know. And so we had, and I some great players. Huey McCracken, you know, was on guitar. I didn't understand Huey. I played with him over the years, but you know, there were some good 802 musicians. But we had things like he had a string quartet, and to make it sound like an orchestra, which is still a trick, which I think is brilliant. It works, you know, mix in an accordion behind it. It was pre-synthesizer, you know, to make it sound like a big orchestra, overly orchestrated. I was just rolling with it. I had money. I was making a record. I was just rolling with it. And it was the songs that I brought. I brought a brilliant R&B guitarist. I mean, one of the greatest R&B guitarists I ever had. Brought him from the Midwest. They didn't know what to make of him. You know, they mixed him together, you know, and that was it, you know, and I had signed a 10 record deal to do one album a year for 10 years. And made it through 4 and then had to break it for all sorts of reasons. And that's a very long, involved story.
Yeah. Well, I wanted to ask you the demos that you recorded, did any of those show up on future releases?
On that first album, yeah, Miss Georgia and a bunch of them. Easily Said, all of those, most of the first album was written in Missouri and was on that demo. And that's what the first album was.
How was it? Do you recall the recording session? How did those fare for that first album?
They're pretty good. I mean, I had guys like Buddy Salzberg on drums. These were names that at that point in time were really, you know, hardcore 802 players, but they weren't hip. They were coming out of the system, but they were really professional and really good players, you know. And I was impressed with that, and I was, you know, somewhat intimidated. I had to double my voice. Hutch decided that all my voices should be doubled, and back then you had the double as they did. You had to sing along and match them, and that was an interesting learning situation. I did not know enough to exert myself as an artist. You know, it was all happening too fast, and I didn't really say, no, man, we don't need. Right. Kind of rolled with it, but then I turned around in Miss Georgia, so I'm in New York for a month, and all of a sudden I'm NEW was playing this song, which was like a 4.5 minute song or something, which was unheard of. It was
Right.
in the like MacArthur Park. I think MacArthur Park. I don't know what the timing was, but if you ever listen to the record, if you have it, it goes
Yeah.
a lot of different sections, a lot of different tempo changes, different orchestrations. It was that kind of production thing. But all of a sudden it's playing, I'm hearing it 5 and 6 times a day on WNEW FM, and FM was just new.
Yeah.
FM was just coming out. And once again, as a young kid, all of a sudden I'm going,
Yeah.
here I am.
You've
It's going to go on
arrived.
forever. This is my life.
Right. The naivety of youth, right?
Yeah.
But
But it was heady. It was a good time,
right. It was
And it
definitely
got me, and I got, and I was signed up with IFA and with CMA. I had big agencies. I did the Tonight Show and the Merv Griffin Show and
yeah.
all that
Yeah.
stuff. So I was in the machine, and and I thought, here it goes. And I was playing large concert venues, and
We'll talk about that. I had that question later, but talk about playing on the Tonight Show. Do you have a lot of nerves before you went on there? You were
I
going to
was
get
at that point in time, once again, we're talking a long time ago, and I now have the benefit of reflecting, and enough life experience, that I was pretty stupidly arrogant at that point in time. So, which overcame a lot of nerves. I had a lot of nerve rather than a lot of nerves.
right. Right.
But I remember the thing about it, but I got on this Tonight Show because I was with IFA at the time, and people might not understand how these things work, but Tonight Show really wanted Burt Lancaster as a guest.
Right.
He was not easy to get. So they made a deal. They said, well, if you'll take, and I think that I had, might have been the third album. I'm not sure. It was the second album. And I was going to be given 2 songs, and it was getting a lot of play, and I was out on the road. I was running for Blood, Sweat, and Tears almost exclusively. And so they made a deal. They said, we'll give you Burt Lancaster, but you got to put Cooper on the show.
Uh-huh.
I didn't know this at the time. I'm going, well, that's fine, So I get on and I'm booked, and I'm on the last time slot of the show. I knew I wasn't going to walk over to the couch. I wasn't that. I was just going to be a musical thing, and that was fine with me. And the Tonight Show was extremely potent at that point in time. I mean,
Yeah.
Nothing bumped you like the Tonight Show.
Yeah.
And Phyllis Newman was a woman who, I don't know what she did, but she was a talk host regular. She was real affable. And Carson sat, and I'm sitting back there waiting to go on. I'm watching the clock. And Phyllis Newman is talking and talking. And Carson is asking her more and more questions. And I'm looking at the clock, and I'm going, what's going on here,
Mhm.
And I got bumped. They called it off. Now, my agent and everything, and I'm irritated, I'm not aware, that they were really kind of like going, well, you want to try to shove something down our throat. Here, we'll show you. It was a political thing between Fred DeCordova, who was the producer, and the IFA agent. I found later, because my managers and partners ended up booking this Tonight Show for like 20 years after that. All the people I knew booked it. Got the inside scoop on it. And but they had to rebook me. And so then I went back and did those 2 songs, and once again they dragged it out so that I had an up-tempo song and a down-tempo song. But the first time, I mean, I was a big deal. Family, friends all over the country, and Tonight Show, they all got there, turned it on, and no Cooper,
Yeah. Yeah.
Second time they came back, and they ended up making me do the shorter of the 2 songs, which was the down tempo song. So, but regardless of how it worked out, it bumped up my pay scale massively. It filled my bookings in all sorts of venues. I mean, it was a really, really powerful thing in those days to be on the Tonight Show.
Great promo to be on it. Yes, exactly. Get your name out there.
And credibility, even though because the public didn't know that I was a trade out for Burt Lancaster. Oh, this guy was on the Tonight Show. He must be good.
Right, right. I just watched. Sometimes I like to go back and watch these old movies from the 70s. I think it was 1970. Airport. Remember the one of the first disaster movies, right?
Yeah.
Then they had the Towering Inferno and uh Poseidon Adventure.
Right.
Anyway, yeah, this one in Burt Lancaster was like the head of the airport, you know. And just to watch some of the bad acting, but they were all big names, they
Oh,
had on there, but just the god awful acting, by today's standards. It's funny.
well, that
It's
was kind
humor.
of, that was the cusp of a generational shift. I mean, it
Yeah,
wasn't shortly thereafter those names were relegated as old school and,
right. Right. You're right about that. Yeah. Well, at times your voice, and I know you've heard this before, probably a million times, and you mentioned him previously, Jim Croce. It has that intonations and kind of the voice fluctuations. Uh, but he was coming up the same time you were. You guys were like, so you couldn't really say he was an influence. You weren't mimicking or hearing him. You
you're
know,
more
you're
peers. Yeah.
yeah, your peers exactly. So it just so happened that your voices, at times are very similar, in singing style. So
And he also wrote yeah, at that point in time there it was this confessional songwriter kind of thing,
yeah,
you
yeah,
writing
right from
about
in here.
about and the angst of being alive in the world at age 21,
Right, right.
but then but Croce also wrote and Harry Chapin,
Yeah,
more narrative story kind of things, which moves along. I mean, when James Taylor first came out, he was very much confessional. When you think about a lot of those
yeah,
songs, uh,
right.
it was an
Yeah,
interesting time.
yeah, yeah, and interesting. I wanted to talk about the two albums that I have that I'm familiar with, and a few of the songs on there, and just kind of get your maybe your backstory or influences or 2 cents worth, or more than 2 cents worth, if you would. Uh, Bless the Children uh, has a breezy, folky, jazzy kind of sound with a little bit of blues and some Baroque in the mix, I think. Um, I like the flute, and the strings. You mentioned that a little bit earlier, but I like those additions.
That was yeah, that album was the second album.
Right.
Uh, and so there, I was no longer sitting in the Midwest writing the type of songs the first albums were. I mean, I'd done a lot more, and my perspective had changed. I was living in Manhattan. I was on the road with Blood, Sweat, and Tears as the opening act, and the sound man, a guy named Bill Motzing, was an Australian guy. It's freaky kind of as I talk about. Most of these guys have passed on these names. I feel like I'm going through, whistling by the graveyard or something. But a wonderful guy and a great classical musician and great ears. And Bobby Colomby wanted to produce the album, uh, expressed interest in producing the album. But Bill Motzing and I got along really well, and he wanted to produce. So he brought in some of that string arrangement and flute things
Yeah.
were the influence of him. And as opposed to the Hutch Davies approach with the string quartet and the accordion, Bill was a really fine arranger that had an understanding of trends of popular music at the time. I mean, now we listen to it and it's dated, it's, when it's from, but back then it was pretty on mark. It was pretty upfront. And also he had been mixing and working with Blood, Sweat, and Tears, which was crossing over into that other instrumentation anyway. So that's a lot of how that came about. And some great, great players on it. It began my well, relatively long-term relationship with Bernie Purdy, who was the drummer, who was just a monster, Richard Davis played on that album, I believe, Elliot Randall, a lot of things. A lot of the
Elliot.
guys that I played through, really great, really wonderful players that I understood then the quality of the musicians I was playing with, who were playing with me, which is something.
Right.
And most of them, now I realize that most of them, have been, are very important names in the history of recorded, American popular music. They were. So that was a really good project. That was done with at A&R Studios. Phil Ramone, who was Billy Joe's producer, was actually
Mhm.
the manager of A&R Studios back there, and a guy named Elliot Shiner, who was an engineer who became a partner of mine for some time and worked me all the way through. Once again, these guys that have long established, and prestigious careers. Elliot, I think, has Grammy from the Eagles and Steely Dan and things like that.
Steely Dan,
At
right?
the
That's what
time,
I.
though, we were all just there doing it.
Yeah.
Except for the 802 guys. The 802 guys were just cranking out sessions. They played on everything.
Well, I think from that album, I want to mention "Sad-Eyed Queen of the Mountains." That may be
Yeah,
my favorite on the album.
yeah. I haven't thought of that song in a long time. That's that hit. Da, 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 da. Yeah, the strings in
Uh,
there.
yeah.
Uh, and one of the great things about that, Odetta covered. I was playing in the Village. I think I was playing, I don't know where, maybe the Vanguard or somewhere. And Odetta came in and was in the audience and came up to me after the set and said, I would like to cover that song. And she did a thing called Odetta Sings, and it was like Elton John and a bunch of things. You can still find it. I think it's called Odetta Sings. It was one of the few times she covered. She tried to move into a little more current singer-songwriter
Yeah.
type repertoire.
Yeah.
And she covered Bless the Children, which was always a great thing, and became a very dear friend, and it was that was one of the highlights of that album for me. But it was and it's still around, and that album actually got re-released. I didn't even understand it until I went online sometime, because I really don't Google myself or anything, but someone said, I have Bless the Children. And I'm jumping ahead. You probably would ask these questions somewhere along the line,
No,
but
that's all right. Go ahead.
that album got re-released, and I saw it, and it was actually the album with the artwork and
Mhm.
the whole thing. And I went, well, wait a minute, man. No one discussed this with me. Not that I was. My contract is long gone. I mean, this happened within the last 15 years.
Yeah.
Still by contract,
Right.
still should participate in some fashion. And I
Yeah.
had to track it down. That it was licensed by some Wounded Bird Records, and they sent me to Alligator, who sent me to Warner Brothers, and on and on. So it was interesting.
Do you remember the cover of the album is striking? Do you remember the photography, the photo session for that?
Totally, totally. In
Yeah.
fact, just got back in touch with me.
Uh-huh.
Boy, blanking on his name is just terrible.
Well, I shouldn't have asked you that one then. That's
It
okay.
was it was a very successful at the time, kind of like Eyes of Laura Mars photographer in Manhattan. He was a fashion guy.
Okay.
I lived in a 4th-floor brownstone on the top floor. Right below me was the head of ABC News, Ov Weston, and right below him was Steve Ladner. And
Okay.
Steve Ladner and his wife at the time, Rebecca, and she was like the person, and they were very artsy, very eccentric, but I knew him, and Ladner said, I said, Ladner, you want, and at that point in time, I could hire people. I had money to do this, so I could talk to them professionally. And I said, Steve, let's do this. So forgetting I think that I don't remember what the album cover looks like. I believe it's kind of like me, but there's a background of a bridge in the sunset. Is that the front
The
cover of
sunset, yes, the
Well,
sunset.
that was
You're
a
turned
composite.
sideways. You're
That
turned
was a
sideways with the
composite,
guitar.
and I didn't even understand back then. He fabricated that. He put that. He took that
Okay.
shot on the same day, but put that in there. And then the
Okay.
backside is covers of I'm sitting in a tree in Central Park at one point, I think, and then we went to a place called the Cloisters, which is uptown, which is a medieval place, and got into the cloisters themselves, which you can't go, and shot that because we had these connections. I
Yeah.
remember that day very, very well. My girlfriend at the time let me borrow her coat, which was some sort of strange embroidered sheepskin collar thing. You know? It was there, man. I was in the groove.
You're in the groove. You were right in the midst of it. Well, you mentioned James Taylor earlier. It's a nice cover of Something in the Way She Moves on that album too, I think.
That was well, actually, you know what it was? It's Jerry Hyman, who is the trombonist of Blood, Sweat, and Tears, in that first band with David Clayton Thomas, not the Al Cooper band, the first David Clayton Thomas band.
Yeah.
Jerry also wanted to produce the album, but then he decided, he's the one that said, "Why don't you let Motzing do it?" And he was the one, because he was a brass guy. He understood where Motzing was coming from. But he also brought me the song, and it was before James had released it. And he said, you should do this song, So I got permission to do that, and loved it,
Yeah.
And Bill put the arrangement behind it.
Yeah. Before I heard the song, I used to think it was the Beatles, something, because
Right.
something in the way she moves, it's the same lyric. It's the same. I would get them confused.
I guess I've never looked that up. I think that I don't know. I don't know which came first, the chicken or the egg. With Apple, so it doesn't really matter. It was all a familial thing
right.
anyway.
That's very true. That's right. That's right. And then again, Brother Love again recalls Jim Croce. I mean, I can hear him singing that one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I remember that. Well, that was also, I'm in the middle of writing a novel at the moment for about the last 8 or 9 months, which is just because I said I would do it before I dropped my body. And as I reflect on that period of time, because it's based off a script that I wrote some years back, it was as turbulent, easily as turbulent in those years in this country as it is now.
Yeah.
And so, and Vietnam was very, very present, and public was very vocal about it. I was in that camp of being a young draftable guy, who was definitely against the war for a number of reasons, but I'm sure self-interest had a great deal to do with it. So my sensibilities, and Dylan had turned me on to protest. So it was kind of a soft version of that. It was like more of a thing, rather than saying, "Who are these jerks doing this?" I was trying to offer some sort of solution to it. Love is the answer. Love.
Right.
Peace, love feeds.
Right. Well, you are a really good storyteller. That comes across in so many of your songs. From 71's The Ballad of C.P. Jones, the title track again, Jim Croce. It really, really sounds a whole lot like Jim. But then I also like Lonely Blue, Rhinestone in the Rough.
Rhinestone in the Rough was written by a friend of mine,
Uh-huh.
Ken Shepard. In fact, and the Rhinestone actually ended up moving to North Florida about 2 hours away. So I'm still in touch with her, the woman who he wrote it about.
Okay.
It's a lovely thing. Light my cigar, shine my boots. It's kind of like, I'm not sure it would go over so well these days. And Lonely Blue was written on Long Island, I remember, on Fire Island, as a matter of fact, on the beach. And C.P. Jones was my grandfather, Clarence Percival Jones. And I wrote that song. I was opening up for Chicago at a place called in Lambertville, New Jersey. Great big. The stage would rotate around as you were on it. So you would play and hit it's called the Music Circus. I forget what it was called. I think it still is around Lambertville, New Jersey. And after my set, I went back to the hotel, and for some reason, wrote that song that night, you know.
You know, the Chicago was my very first concert that I ever went to, 1976. So
Well, this is Terry. Terry was still playing guitar at that point in time,
yeah, yeah, yeah,
and
yeah. He was still playing when I saw
he
him.
was stunning. He was stunning. You
Right,
know, and a lot
right,
of people don't remember. Chicago went on and reached larger and larger ascendancy. You know, after even after his death.
right.
I'm not sure a lot of people really understand how great of a guitarist he was.
Yeah, yes. I can remember him in concert and some of his solos. Yeah, I can remember that very well. But you're right, tragic, tragic. Uh, well, also, Fat Lovebirds, another song I
Another
enjoy.
not same guys. These are guys out of that town I came from, Missouri.
Uh,
Rhinestone in the Rough was written by a guy named Ken Shepard,
yeah.
and uh, Fat Lovebirds was written by a guy named Michael Cochran, who is still around. I actually been writing with him when I go back out there sometime. He's still playing. He went on to these are great, smart, good writers, great players. Mike went on. He actually wrote both Les Paul and Chet Atkins biographies,
Oh, okay, okay.
and so he became kind of a writer himself. But he still was playing. He's at this point in time in our lives, people, musicians, it's unfortunate to see the physical things are happening that are impeding people's ability to do it. I'm very lucky. I'm very grateful this hasn't, because it's a really hard thing to see people who've spent their lives and this
Right.
is their vehicle for processing everything that happens to them. And it's, and all of a sudden your hand's not working right, and it's a very, very hard thing, but, so we keep finding ways to continue on creating in spite of
Yeah.
those limitations that are thrown at us.
Well, you do, and your voice is in fine fettle. At least a couple of years ago, from
Yeah,
the last,
it's holding up.
it's holding up. Another a better way. I wish it was longer. That was a minute 39.
It
Kind
was
of
fast. It was
a
fast. Wait, that would have been off of, is that off of C.P. Jones too?
yeah,
Mr.
yes,
Johnson's living in the city. Tough
yeah.
work's the only pay. There I am. There I am in Manhattan getting burned out of the city.
Uh-huh. Yeah,
Midwestern boy, you know,
right.
getting tired of living in the city and getting ready to split, to drop out and break my contract and go to Vermont, and that's where that, surely there's a better way. Yeah. I'm trying to think of
Yeah, yeah,
great. That was done with most of that band. That was done once again at A&R. A&R at the studio Midtown and the studio across town. That was done in the studio across town. Elliot was the engine. I think that Elliot and I produced that. We co-produced Cooper Shiner Productions.
okay.
And a lot of Van Morris's band out of Woodstock was down there. Buzzy
Mhm.
Featon, Gary Malabar, Gene Dinwiddie, people like that. Are fun band, very loose, very marching. We had charts. I still have the charts. We had elaborate charts,
Uh-huh.
beautifully written.
Yeah.
I mean, Sky Mossing with school. Elliot and I went in there and I said, we're just going to play this. We're going in here. We got head charts. We got chord changes. Let the players come up with it. And a very, you listen to it and it is loose. But it's but I like it. I'm very pleased that that event happened.
Right. Yes, exactly.
But
Well,
also
nice.
by that time, I was starting to realize that roulette was a
Yeah,
death trap for me.
right.
I was getting problems. They were starting to stiff radio state. They were starting to just
Yeah.
withdraw, and
Well,
people
it
were
was,
going, "What's going on, Cooper?" And they were
yeah,
starting to not pay session fees. And I
yeah,
went, "Oh." So at
yeah,
that point in time, I said,
yeah.
"I'll do
It,
whatever I want. I don't have to worry about what they want,"
right,
which is
right.
kind of fun.
It was pretty much a mutual agreement, wasn't it, between you and
Oh no,
Morris?
it
Oh, it
was
wasn't.
very, very, very hard. No,
Oh,
it was
was it? Okay.
because of Fat Lovebirds and
Yeah.
because of Tin Cans and Alleys, because of these friends of mine.
Mhm.
And we had signed away all of my publishing.
Yeah.
Uh, but I wanted to do these songs and I wanted to help my friends. And so when Pete, my manager, and I went in and told, and Pete said, well, and Morris said, what about the publishing on these songs? And Pete said, oh no, we're keeping the publishing on them. We published those songs. And it erupted. Said, you need
Okay.
a gun to own. You don't own nothing, kid. You know,
Okay.
and get him out, you know, and then said, and then at that point in time, shortly thereafter, you know, he said, I'm not going to record you. I'm not going to release you. I'm going to bury you, you know, and that was when that happened. So then, so they wouldn't let me go. It took me 2 years to break the contract. I had to actually just drop out, disappear as far as they were concerned. Lawyers couldn't get rid of it. Ironically, you know, I ended up getting rid of it, getting out of it by appealing directly to Morris. Based upon at one point in time up at his farm, he said, you're either with me or against me. And I said, well, I'm with you, Morris. He says, well, I'm with you too, kid. And I reminded him 2 years later, after I dropped out in the woods, stopped everything, because there was no point in going on at that point in time with him. I was playing thousands of people a week. You know, there would never be a record in the store. I mean, that wasn't the game. The game was to get my publishing, stop it. And so I finally went to him and I said, you know, Morris, you said you were with me. This is not an illustration of being with me. And he looked at me, and this is after lawyers and fights to try to get out, and we're not letting him go, you know. And he looked at me finally and said, all right, kid, and signed me off and got out of it. But even then, that was a verbal agreement. They waited all the way until 79, 10 years before they
10 more years. Wow.
but you know, but there was a verbal agreement that that I could do other things, that they no longer owned everything I wrote.
Okay.
Because up until that, you know, so they didn't push that, even though the paper wasn't actually signed for much later. So I kind of got loose again, and then I began phased.
Well, I guess he figured after that, all that time, he'd put you through the ringer to, you know.
No, I think
not-
that really what it was, I believe that I appealed to his street sensibilities because he was a street guy. You know,
Okay. Okay.
and I
You
appealed,
got-
and that's what really got me out of it, was a personal one-to-one about, hey
Okay.
man,
Yeah.
are you good for your word or not? He went, okay.
Yeah.
He was a character.
Yeah.
I saw him. I didn't see him for many years, and then finally, when I was doing quite well with kids music at Random House, his executive secretary ran into me on the street and said, Cooper, you got to come up here. I got a new management company. What are you up to? And I'm like, well, I said, you're not involved with Morris, are you? She said, oh, no, no, no. And I'm walking up the stairs and I get into the office and I hear from a room down the hall, hey, Bubba. And, you know, and
You recognize that.
looks me in. And I went into, and I sat in front of him, and at first I was that 21-year-old kid again. By now, you know, in my 40s, I have children. I'm just renegotiated 2 contracts at Random House. I'm fine, you know. And I'm sitting across from him, and he's diagnosed with terminal cancer and looking to go for a 10-year jail sentence for extortion out in LA for Strawberry Records guy, physically doing something to a Strawberry Records owner, you know. And about 10 minutes later, I'm going, you know, this guy doesn't have it over me anymore.
Right.
You know? And that was a really freeing thing. And I didn't resent him. I didn't hold anything against him. I just kind of went, that's that. I put that away. You know, I was very surprised how it pulled me back in there, though. You know, at first he was an intimidating man.
Right, right. Well, it was what it was, or it is what it is. Yeah. So you're, yeah, you moved on from there.
Moved on from there.
Yeah. Well, speaking of moving on, how did Cooper Dodge form?
I would play a lot of colleges, and Ohio was, I mean, you could book, and there was a thing called the NEC, I think, was you'd go to conventions, you'd block book. I remember, like George Carlin would be on these things. We'd go out and we'd do showcases, and there'd be all of these colleges, regional colleges, and you could walk out of there with 30, 40 dates, all in that area. So Ohio was full of colleges. And I would play the University of Ohio in Athens, uh, which is a great town at that point in time. And I'd play there, and at one time, the local golden boy of Athens, Ohio, who's still in school, walks up to me at the end of my set and says, "You're going to see a lot of me." And I went, "Okay," you know. And then and that was that. Yeah, well, I won't disclose too much about him, but at that point in time, and then about a year and a half later, I'm walking to my apartment on 87th Street in New York, and there's this guy, and he had an apartment 3 doors down from me. And I went, "Wow," you know. And we started playing together and wrote together and played really well together. And that was John. And so we started out as a duo. I was living in Vermont then. He moved out of the city, moved to Vermont. A really fine writing relationship and a really good. We sang really well together. Our voices moved really well together, and that lasted for probably, I don't know, 5 or 6 years. Built through bands, played a lot, went to LA, spent a lot of time, traveled all the time. Where it was a successful band, kept them alive, kept it going. A lot of demos, a lot of time in LA. At one point in time, there was the Knack, and there was when the Knack was just coming out. We played the Troubadour, and there, this guy Ken Tucker would say, the top 10 unsigned bands in LA, and we'd be on that list, unsigned, and but constant demo sessions, fronted, not on our dime. People coming in saying, doing this, independent producers. Felt really strong, worked a lot, grew, would go back and forth cross country a couple times a year. And it was a good run. It was a very good band. Ended up with a drummer named Richard X. Heyman, who is still active, really done a lot as a singer-songwriter himself. I'm having with a guy named Ronnie Johnson tonight, who is the horn player, who had turned up 5 years later.
Okay.
But and then we ended up going back east. We did a stop, and Steve Goodman produced a 4-track thing for us that we were trying to get a record deal on. That didn't work out. Ended up back in a long time in New Jersey. Got signed to Atco Records, released one single, and then they hooked us up with the producer of Air Supply, and he and I didn't get along too well. And I was writing movies at the same time anyway. And I came back from Jamaica writing a script, and he convinced my partner that my partner didn't need me,
One of those, a divider. Well, we'll talk.
Divide and conquer.
Yeah, there you go. Well, how did talk about
Cooper Dodge? But it was a great run. It was a great band, and they remained good friends. And
we'll seg into that. How did you become involved in writing scores and for TV and movies?
When Pete, my manager, when Roulette cut us out, I mean, he was never let this guy back in the office again. And so there's no representation. Morris had it down to just me and Morris, and I'd walk in and he'd give me cash, and he and it was something. And so Pete we both went into, but he moved out of being my manager because I was dropping out trying to break the contract. Started in concert promotion, actually in Florida. Big deal with an ex-agent of mine, Joe Lambuster. Both these guys have passed away now. Called L&S Production. Did most of the big rock concerts in Florida. Back then, you had promoters had regions, and if you wanted the big acts, they got them. They had the big venues, and they had that locked in. And then they did a huge concert in the Orange Bowl, a very successful production company, and did the Orange Bowl with, I don't know, Fleetwood Mac and I don't know, five of the large and the Eagles, five of the largest acts at that point in time, and it got rained out. And when you're doing productions back then, the IRS was at the gate. You didn't report how much money you made, because there was too much cash. The IRS was there at the count, and they took their money then. And so they had to take care of that, and then they had to refund all these tickets because the concert was totally rained out, and that took that company down. And Pete said, "I'm gone." He went to LA and started promoting movies, and the first thing he went out there to promote Animal House.
Okay.
And so he said, "Cooper, get out here. It's a whole new world." And I had broken the contract, and I was with Cooper Dodge, and that's when the band started going out there. And I would go out there, and Pete and we always remained. He found the project and the funding. I fulfilled the obligation from the creative end, no matter what it was. So we started doing all sorts of stuff. So I do radio spots. I would do advertising, and then he got into film promotion and home video, and that ran for some years. And that was so. I was always working, creating things. I would write things like when home video came out. I can't believe I'm disclosing this stuff. When home video came out, and it was all a new market, VHS home video. And a lot of them were kind of like how-to things, Jane Fonda exercise videos, and wedding organizers. And I would write songs for these things, and the Slim Gourmet, which I think the lyric was, "From pâté de foie gras to cordon bleu, Caesar salad and barbecue, you can prepare and enjoy them too. Well, something to take your troubles away, you and the Slim Gourmet." I still remained fast. I was fast. I could do an assignment really well. My name wasn't attached to it, so I didn't really care about it, and I had production people and facilities. I knew how to do it, so it was just easy, So it's like, it's easy for Pete because he can make a deal with me that he couldn't make with anybody else, and so I did a lot of that. And then other partners did a thing called the Heavyweights of Comedy. I remember I did that, and Elliot Shiner connected me with the major commercial producer in New York. I did a spot for Avon. When I was with Roulette, I did all these stupid things, like the guy who would be proud that he didn't sign the Beatles. I turned things down. Now I go, why did I do that?
Why did you?
I'm not doing commercials,
Yeah.
So, but finally, Elliot said, "Man, come in here and sing. It's an Avon commercial. Come and sing it."
Right.
Sing a little jingle. He
Right.
said,
There
"Really
you
want to do this?" So I went
That
in.
that was quite lucrative. Jingle writing.
I fell in love with my mailbox. It was unbelievable.
You camped out by your
that's
mailbox.
when I went, "What on earth was I thinking back?" Back then.
Yeah.
And so it was just a lot of the time at that period of time, a lot of the people who I had been doing all the stuff with in New York when I first was recording started branching out. The business was changing.
Yeah.
Films were going in, and there were more independent labels coming out, and punk scene was coming in. It was just not that same machine unless you were at Columbia or Warner Brothers or Geffen Records, and you were in that whole loop. So I was just a working musician and a working producer and writer.
Yeah. Well, then you started writing songs for children and released books, cassettes, CDs through Random House.
Well, because of these home videos,
Uh-huh.
first thing we did, Gymboree, which is a children's exercise thing. I don't know if they still exist, but it was big at one point in time, a national chain of, you take your kids, it was like physical exercise, gym for little kids, daycare. And we did a video for them when they were first coming out. an hour-long video on Gymboree. And Pete once again went, wow, you know, there's a market here. What can we do with this? You know, and he said, and I had a young son, and he said, write some kid songs, Cooper. You know, let's do that. so, so my wife had an orchid business, and she would go on collecting trips out of the country. And I made my son a deal that I would write him a song a night instead of reading him a story a night while she was gone.
Okay.
So I wrote, you know, 14 songs or something in her absence. And I said, I got them. What do you want to do? And so he said, well, let's make a kid's video. And so we made a video, produced it ourselves, spent a lot of money, high end, not really in the right sensibility. We didn't really know. And it was kind of like, you know, we were not the right profile of people who are supposed to be writing children's entertainment. As well as we tried, it was a little, we, you know, but we took it to CES, which is the Consumer Electronics something. It's a big convention in Las Vegas, still goes on every year. And it was called WeTV, and MTV was just kind of making its bones. So I said WeTV, and to cop that, it was like MTV Kids, you know, and we had a host, Roscoe the Rabbit, and all this stuff. And we went to the CES, and the vice president of Random House, who had just left Children's Television Workshop, a woman named Sharon Lerner, was out there, and she saw it, and she went, you know, there's something here. And Random House had just always been a book company, did not,
Yeah.
you know, and they're not a public company, they're privately owned and they're established. But they had brought her over, and she had started the audio and video department of Random House, which they had not been involved before. And so she was shopping around, and she said, you know, we want this, we want to do this, but we have to recut it and change it. Yeah. So we did WeTV for Random House, and which was a big step. It was a big company, you know, large budget, all this stuff, all the promotion. And then Sharon and I became, and then it just worked. And so at that point, then she started doing, a guy did a thing called Cartoons, Cartunes. And so we're in a time where cassette players in automobiles are kind of like, wow, you know, kind of like GPS on your front, you know,
Yeah, right.
ooh, my car has a cassette player.
Uh-huh.
Not some stupid 8-track, we have a cassette
Right.
player.
Latest and greatest.
And this guy had come up with this brilliant concept at that point in time about, you know what, we're going to make an audio cassette and a little workbook that goes with it. And parents will travel with their kids, and this will make it a more pleasant journey. But he didn't have the book. So she said, can you, and the books were activities. They were kind of like very elaborate, what's that? The menus you used to get, I forget what, where there'd be mazes and things on it. I forget what restaurant did it, but you know.
Oh yeah, yeah. Was it Kip's Big Boy?
No,
No, it wasn't. It was Denny's
anyway,
or okay.
like Waffle House or something. They had menus, so where the kids, you know, and they'd give you crayons, you know.
Right.
So the books were that they were games that had to be created, and the song lyrics were in that. So I wrote the book for that, and she just said, you know what, why don't you and I and this company work on this? So I went on to do 14 more of those with Random House, you know, and then it was a very interesting thing. They would, and once again, though now I write and I've always written as an artist, I'm also a really good assignment guy. I can do it. And so they would say, and she really trained me into the thing of topical things. So the first thing she said, you know, what do you have? What are kids? And I had kids. And I said, well, my son loves dinosaurs. She said, all kids love dinosaurs. So I
Mhm.
said, well, why don't I do something called Dinosongs?
Yeah.
And I did, and it was extremely successful, still sells,
Um,
you
is that one of your hot items?
know. Well, as far as the kids stuff goes, but
Yeah.
I have other ones. I spook all of them. They were very, it was very good. She steered me very well.
Well,
Dinosongs, Boogie Woogie Bugs, um, Spooky Tunes, Halloween. They
yeah.
were smart. They knew, and so all the songs would be related around that thing. Hanukkah, which I knew nothing about, uh, but I still every year, you know, Halloween, boom, CD sell. Hanukkah, CD sell. Dinosongs kind of just crosses over the board. I've only just my wife. That's a long story. Like when that ended up, Random House decided they didn't want to be in that market, uh,
Mhm.
and when they dropped it very graciously, and I'm thankful for it, all of the rights were rescinded back to me, which is
Okay, that's good.
unbelievable.
Right.
And so I sat on them, and I was done with doing all that stuff. And I did a lot of. It was a good long career. I worked all the time, you know, kept a lot of people employed. Sales were very good. You know, made a good living. Would go out and do support things. Would play kid shows, and it was not. It was okay. It was a good. It was, you know, it was a good professional end, but artistically, it wasn't. Except I'm very proud of the songs. The songs are good songs. And their song, my whole concept was make songs that the parents aren't going to go, oh God, not again. You know,
Yeah.
that even though the content was there, you know, and it was not, and it was aimed at children,
Yeah.
music was good enough, and it was really good music, you know, to keep intact.
Yeah.
And so that was a good
Well,
Random House. And when I got it all back, then years later, my wife said, Cooper, what are you doing? Why don't you do these? And so I've digitized 4 of them now. I still have another 10 I could do, but I haven't gotten around to it.
you haven't got around to. Well, it was nice that you could tap into your inner child too, in doing
It was,
those.
it was, you know,
Yeah.
it was a really good thing. And it was great at that point in my life. I had young kids, you know,
Yeah.
and that's what took me into education, you know,
Okay.
step.
Well, that's what we want to talk about next. Well, it's probably nice to hear
Well, you've
back
rendered
from.
me on. I mean, this is a long retrospective here.
It is. It's a this is your life without all the guests.
Without Ralph.
Right. But it is a bio. That's what I want these things to be. Well, have you heard back from a lot of the kids, or have they as they've grown up?
Unbelievable, unbelievable.
Yeah.
I mean, actually,
Yeah.
now that I and so I got a website up, which is another story. But you know, but once these things came out, and I don't know how to put it really. I always thought of these things, even though I'm very proud of it, and I really think it's good work and it holds up.
Yeah.
I've always kind of relegated it to, well, that's my kid stuff. I don't know what I mean. That's a really stupid way to look at it, but I did, and at this point in time, I get things from, you know, I listen to this all, you know, I know every word of this. I listen to it every day when school, I want my grandchildren to hear it. I mean, you know, and I had a thing, you know, a woman says, you know, I know all the words. I did a thing called Star Tunes, which is all about, you know, fairly scientific. There's a lot of NASA footage, you know, songs about the planets. Mr. Sun, you know, put the planets in the line, planet Earth, all that kind of. And she said, and she wrote me an email. She said, because I hadn't digitized it. She said, I know every word of Star Tunes. I listened to it forever. Uh, is there any way I can get a copy of it? She said, I want it for my daughter. And she said, I am now a NASA engineer in Daytona.
Is that right?
And I said, I said, do you think that music influenced your decision? She said, it made my decision. You know, so things like that, I get unbelievably gratifying responses of this more than my other music that
music.
I did as a musician in a career, I really, time tends to tell me that, possibly the best thing I did were these songs, that had the more impact than the other things, and I mean, I could go on. The stories are really heartfelt and wonderful, and it's interesting that they live on with absolutely no promotion. I mean, it's
Yeah,
just like chumming. It's out there and people look it up and find it.
yeah. But you had tapped into that. Yeah. And maybe that was your real calling, that you didn't realize,
It was
But
a it was a
yeah,
long run, and then it led me. I mean, uh, as I'm going through this, I mean, I'm starting. You're making me see this progression of how things
uh,
work and how the skill set kept
yeah,
expanding, applying to other
yeah.
things. And so there is a kind of linear flow
That's
to it,
right. That's
and the
one of the
kids.
that's one of the rewarding Don things about doing this is the interviewee, you guys learning some things too, maybe that were always there, but you just weren't, you have to go back and kind of relive that, and go through that again,
Yeah,
and see like
and there's not really a lot of reason to do that until you offer this opportunity, and that's what happened. The kids stuff because, and then the town I lived in, and it was very high profile. The kids market had just emerged. Once again, we were in the right place, and it was just happening. And all of a sudden, for the first time, Billboard magazine started a children's music section, which didn't exist. And the children's music was growing faster than any other thing. However, it started out from here,
yeah,
where everything else is here, So for a while, the industry got all excited about, oh, it's a burgeoning thing, And I had, charted stuff on kids stuff and charted videos and Parents' Choice Awards and all this kind of stuff. So I was notorious in that thing. Raffi had come out about maybe 3 years prior, and he was the first guy that really crossed over in that thing. Other than Golden Book Records that we all knew, the little engine that could and all that stuff.
right.
Raffi's brought that in. And I was right there, and there's a band named Rosenschantz and a guy named Bill Schantz, who I ended up writing with for years. Joni Bartell, there were some names. It was just fairly Hat Palmer, fairly small group, and I was amongst them. So in this little local town in Connecticut, my reputation, they knew what I was doing. And my
Right.
kids were in the school, and they asked me to come in and offered me a thing called to record, to write, to infuse songwriting into the curriculum in elementary school.
Okay.
And and they allowed me to build a recording studio, a small recording studio in a room in the building. And I wasn't the teacher, but I would go in there and I would go into these classrooms and do units with them and write songs. Then I'd bring them in and record them and release things. And and I enjoyed that. It was really interesting, and I loved working with the kids. And
How long did you do that?
Song Lab lasted for about maybe initially for about maybe 2 years as me just coming in when I could because I was out doing all this stuff anyway professionally and doing that.
Mhm.
And then the state of Connecticut started a thing called the Higher Order Thinking Schools, hot schools, that was about arts integration. And
Mhm.
they just came out and they said we're going to give 6 schools in the state grants that are going to give you support for artists to come in and bring in their art discipline into the school and figure out how to integrate that into a curriculum unit so the arts are in there. It was very lofty. And I had just started because of this. I did a full town musical right before this grant was issued, where of this whole town, and I wrote it with a partner and I wrote all the music and I performed in it, and from grandparents to little kids, all the cast, it was like something out of a Jimmy Stewart movie, and it was and a huge, wonderful community thing. I mean, it consumed the community and brought them all sorts of factions together. And part of the criteria for this grant from the state was the town had this some sort of verification or proof that it was supportive of the arts. Well, we had just done this huge thing, and that got the school the Haas grant.
Ah, okay.
But they didn't know how to make it work. But I had been making it work already with Song Lab. So they said, tell you what, why don't you come in here and coordinate how we integrate this grant into our school, which got me in conjunction with the Commission of the Arts of Connecticut. And within about 8 months, the Commission of the Arts said, man, you should be a master teaching artist. I mean, you can still do that. And so then I did that. I became a master teacher on the state and started doing that in schools around the state.
Mhm.
And that went on for a bit of time. And then the principal in the school, the music teacher dropped out somewhere like in March, married the janitor, ran off with the janitor or something. I forget how it worked out.
Okay.
No, she didn't run off with the janitor. She took a job as a counselor. She ended up marrying the janitor. And the principal called me and said, can you come in here and take over this music class for the rest of the year? And I said, what do I know about that? She goes, well, more than most people. And I said, I don't even have my college degree. I left the spring semester of my senior year.
Yeah.
And she said, we'll work that out, because all of a sudden she said, it's a short-term thing. And anyway, what happened then after that, every time I would say I couldn't do it, they kept petitioning me more.
Oh, talk
You
you
can do
into
whatever
it.
you want. You can have the
Yeah.
program,
Yeah.
pay for your
Yeah.
school. We'll hold it. We'll get dispensation from the state, and so I ended up going back to school and getting, at age 50, I think, and getting my bachelor's, which I couldn't find. I was 90 hours short or something. And I had to do that, and they couldn't find it. Was on microfiche somewhere in New Jersey.
Oh, microfiche. Yeah.
But they gave me, no, actually what it was, they gave me 90 hours. The university gave me 90 hours. So I was like 30 hours short.
Mm.
And so they kept me, allowed me to teach because they got dispensation and on and that's it. And I did that for 14 years and learned massive amounts.
Yeah.
And once again, I got to say, where is the most impact I made as an artist? Once again, I have students that are playing on Broadway. I have students in the Philharmonic. I mean, those are, every teacher can say this, and it's pretty amazing. And one of the great parts was that when I started, my kindergarten students, there were students that I knew even in kindergarten.
Uh-huh.
I mean, they had good rhythm, they had pitch at age 5, and you just kind of knew.
Yeah.
And then I went through that school and I taught in middle school, and I retired. And once again, a teacher left, the select chorus teacher and the theory teacher. She one and the same, took a vice principal's job, and the high school called me. The superintendent called me and said, would you consider coming back to work
Mhm.
just for the start of the school year? Because she left right before the school year started. And they could only keep me for 90 days. They were going to have to do all sorts of economic things and pay me all sorts of stuff. And I said, okay. And my select chorus and my advanced theory students,
Yeah.
my kindergarten class.
Wow.
And that was the last thing I did. And the same kids many of the same kids I recognized at 5 years old
Yeah.
were advanced students that were way beyond my theory expertise. I mean, I was just playing catch up and keep the class going.
Well, you'll appreciate this, Don. My son had high school choir for 4 years. He's a senior. He's graduating next Saturday. He's graduating. He thoroughly enjoyed choir. You conducted the AP choir of high school students. And just hearing about and reading and learning about how influential people who are students who take choir, you know, how they how they are when their GPAs a lot of times are higher, that their scores on tests rank higher than other students, so it's that power and that's of music and how that really plays into it.
But
It's
also
got
when they do cryonic photography of the brain,
right. Yeah,
when you are, and we can consider the voice an instrument, when you are using an instrument, especially if you're playing an instrument and sight
yeah,
reading at
right,
the same time, more areas of your brain are firing off than
right.
anything else, because you have
Yeah,
tactile, you have
yeah,
auditory, you have all this stuff going on. So
yeah,
the brain studies tend to show that. And
yeah,
choirs,
yeah,
AP choirs, they read. They're not just doing it by
yeah.
ear.
Yeah. Well, I consider music to be the highest art form. I truly do. Well, real quick, let's just talk briefly about your latest album, Pictures and Stories. Pictures and Stories. I think it's a very accomplished album. Maybe some of your best work. Um, a little more guitar. Love the lyrics in that one. It's like keep it simple, drink more water, eat less sugar, and play more guitar. You know,
Well,
I mean,
I'd been in Costa Rica, and I have a place in Costa Rica, and I've been not wearing shoes, and so I think my feet were calloused, and I went back home, and the first morning I woke up and I tapped my feet together, and I couldn't feel anything,
yeah,
and I'm not putting it together. I'm barefoot. The TV was on. I was watching the morning news, and there was an ad for diabetes 2 and neuropathy. I
somebody was
immediately
talking to you.
diagnosed myself with
Uh-huh.
diabetes 2, and I got out of bed and I'm walking down the hall and I'm going, well, I'm going to drink more water. I'm going to eat less sugar. And I got downstairs and I'm walking by my library and I see my Martin there, and I went and play a little more guitar, and I went and
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
wrote the song
exactly.
in about 20 minminutes.
Yeah, yeah. But it's got some great lyrics, but it is, like that KISS, right? Keep it simple,
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, yeah.
I think so. The course of time. That's a really nice track. Really, really. I like the guitar sounds you get in that one. And then the lyrics, like guitar hero in the clubs at night, invisible by the light of day. You know.
That's the guy that I took. That's the R&B guitar player that I took to New York,
Yeah.
who did that. When he went back to the Midwest, some of these same guys, the Fat Lubbers guys, they wanted him to play, and he didn't have a guitar, and so they said, Cooper, because I had bought him a really nice Gibson 335 back then to play in the band, and I kept it. And they said, would you send that out to John? And I said, sure. So I sent it out to him, and about 6 months later, he broke it to pieces on the wall and said, I can't do this anymore. And at the same time, there was a guy in Costa Rica, a real savant, who was a brilliant player down there, who informed me that he had sold both of his guitars and was going to work in a bank because he just couldn't support his family. He had 2 kids, and he gave it up. And that those were the cues for that, but it's a very common story. Like I say, I mean, I don't discount the great luck that I've had to have been able to continue playing music, and I think that all of us, don't really, maybe when we're young, we do it. We're not doing this to get rich and famous. We're
Right.
doing this hoping to make enough that we can not have to divert our time doing something else, and we can continue applying ourselves to our craft.
Very,
And,
very.
but I think that if you pull that off, you're really, really lucky,
You're
because
you're you're in the minority. You are definitely in the minority.
as
The
life,
timing, you said luck and timing, those two factors, Yeah.
and then you got to be able to, you have to be able to back it up,
Right.
but
You have to
but
have, yeah,
you
yeah,
need to be in the right place at the right time, and things.
yeah. Yes, you do, and things have to go your way a little bit. Well, three more tracks. I wanted Southern Gothic. Again, you have a nice way of storytelling. That's a good example right
And
there.
that's new. Those songs are all probably over the last 5 or 6 years. That's recorded just right here on this machine that
Yeah,
I'm talking to you through,
yeah,
which is a different world now too. Um,
yeah,
and it has, there's benefits. If you're a control freak, you love it because you can control everything.
yeah,
Uh, but
yeah,
I miss playing with live bands in the studio, but I don't have that kind of space. But it's no longer, I've moved away from that confessional self thing,
Yeah.
even though all of it still has elements of my life and me in it. I like these narratives that I didn't know anything about. I was driving down south from the Northeast, crossed over into the West Virginia state line, and saw some town called, I think, Johnsville. And I've always written a lot when I drive, and something about his heart was hard as hard as West Virginia coal, black as West Virginia coal,
Yeah. Yeah.
hard as I am. And I thought, well, what the heck is that? And so I started writing a little bit, and I got back down here to Florida, and I said,
Mhm.
well, I'm writing about a villain of some sort, but who is this guy? And I'm looking around, and then things were coming up down here in political, and I've always been keen on politics and was aware of the impact of the big sugar industry in Florida since, turns out when I researched it, since the 1800s or seven, I mean, it's always been subsidized. It's a big deal. And the power they have. And so I thought, well, that's what it is. He's a muscle guy. So I ended up putting the story together. It was I like the song, it's a very interesting story. And then when COVID came along, I went ahead and was stuck in here. So I made videos of it and got it even more explicit. Have you seen the video of it?
No, I need to check that out. I
Check
will.
that
I
out.
will. Oh, well, I'm like you. Driving is my creative juices start working. It's just inspiring. Maybe seeing the countryside or whatever you are, but it gets those creative juices going.
Are you a writer yourself?
Dabble, but not seriously.
Are
No,
you a
not
player?
seriously. No, no. Oh, you mean like in going out to nightclubs and that kind of thing, player?
No, 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 no. I can tell you're not. I wouldn't
Yeah,
have to ask that question. It's obvious.
you can tell that, right? Right off. No, no, I'm not. I'm not. Um, well, two more tracks real quick. Waiting has a nice jazz riff on that one. Like
Yeah.
that. Yeah. Feel
I
to
had
that one.
Costa Rica, I had my buddy, a fisherman, and those guys, and I used to think they were just going out fishing, but they're going out 50 miles out in the Pacific in these little 19-foot pongas, with a 35 horsepower engine, And I would go in, I'd go down to the beach and I'd buy fresh fish. He'd give me fresh fish because it was like family to me. And I'd meet his wife would be down there and his two little boys. And then usually he'd go out with another guy and so his wife in the morning. And I'd go down and I'd get fish in the morning. I went down one morning and Cesar wasn't there. I said, Jenny, where is he? He said, well, he's late. So I said, well, I'll come by tomorrow for fish. And I went back down there the next day and they were there again. And he still hadn't come home. And so there's no cell phones or anything like that going out there. They're just there. Anyway, 3 days. On the third day, when I went down there, finally there was some sort of authorities down there, and they were concerned. And that's what it's about. And I watched, watch the women get more serious and try to keep this optimism. They were fishermen's wives. It was a way of life. But 3 days they started getting worried. End of the story is he did come home
Yeah.
with something like 200 kilos of reds. And I said, Jesus, Cesar, you can't do this to your family. He said, look at all the fish I got.
Yeah.
But
Right.
that's where that song came from. Yeah.
Oh, is that where that? All right. And then one last track I enjoy was Lefty's Gone Missing. That's probably my second favorite on the album. You know what I think of when I hear Lefty? Poncho and Lefty.
Yeah. I actually have a picture on my wall back here, a drawing on a cocktail napkin.
Mhm.
At a guy in Provincetown on the very tip of the Cape, a writer named Eddie Benetti, who's referenced in the song. But he's
Yeah.
out on the run with Benetti again, who is a sparring partner of Norman Mailer's and a guy who I knew and a real salty character. And he said, and we're in a bar, and he says, and he draws this line drawing of a cat. He says, "This is Lefty Duke," and for some reason, it started out, for some reason the song came out. I'm not exactly sure where it is. I just know of other stories like that. My wife is very fond of that song.
She
I
likes that one.
don't perform it much. I don't know why.
Uh-huh.
Uh, it's a different perspective. I mean, I'm really writing it from a woman's perspective.
Yep. Yep. I
So
get that.
in touch with my feminine side, I guess.
Your inner child, your feminine side. Now you just have to get in touch with your masculine side, see.
Yeah, well, I'm working on that.
That's a lifelong process,
I'm on
huh?
camera, otherwise
Right. Okay, well, Don, I really appreciate this, your time and for sharing so much. And going back in that time machine with me. Uh, it's enjoyable. Doing every one of these is enjoyable to me, you know.
well, it's
So
interesting. It's
yeah.
interesting. Like I say, I'm glad you persisted, and it was a very pleasurable thing.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Don.
All right.
And we will be in touch, all right?
Stay awake down there in Wiley.
Yes, I will. I'm gonna be wide awake. Yeah.
Wide awake. All right, man.
All
Good to
right.
meet you.
Good to meet you too, Don.